The most powerful man in Iran is hiding. Right now, at this very moment, 86-year-old Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is not in his palace in Tehran. He's not addressing his people. He's not visible at all. According to reports from Iran International and multiple intelligence sources, Khamenei has retreated to a fortified underground bunker somewhere in Tehran, connected to a network of tunnels designed to withstand nuclear strikes. The man who has ruled Iran with absolute power for 36 years is now underground, fearing for his life. But what forced him there? The answer reveals the greatest crisis the Islamic Republic has faced since the 1979 revolution. On one side, the largest protest movement in Iranian history, with thousands dead in the streets. On the other, a massive U.S. naval armada sailing toward the Persian Gulf, with President Trump declaring he knows exactly where Khamenei is hiding. And in the middle, a regime that's killing its own citizens by the thousands to stay in power. This is Nora Blake, and you're watching Nora Blake. What you're about to see is not speculation. This is the documented breakdown of a 45-year-old theocracy that may be in its final days. The bunker Khamenei is hiding in was built for war, but the threat isn't just from outside Iran's borders, it's from within, because while the Supreme Leader hides underground, his own people are dying on the streets above. And the world is watching. If understanding what's really happening in Iran matters to you, make sure you're subscribed. The crisis didn't start with Khamenei's disappearance into the bunker. It started on December 28, 2025, when the Iranian currency collapsed. And what began as economic protest exploded into something far more dangerous for the regime. December 28, 2025, Tehran's Grand Bazaar. Iranian merchants, the traditional backbone of the regime's support, shut down their shops in protest. The rial had collapsed to record lows, losing over 40% of its value since Israel's June 2025 strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. Inflation had passed 120%. Ordinary Iranians couldn't afford basic necessities. Within hours, protests spread from Tehran to every major city: Isfahan, Mashhad, Shiraz, Qom. What made this different from past protests was the chant echoing through the streets: "Death to the dictator, death to Khamenei." Not death to America, not death to Israel, death to Iran's own supreme leader. By January 1st, 2026, protesters weren't just marching, they were storming government buildings. In Lordagan, demonstrators seized regime offices and burned them. In Qom, the religious heart of Iran's clerical establishment, protesters chased security forces through the streets. The wall of fear that had protected the theocracy for 4 decades was crumbling. Iranian authorities responded with a total internet blackout on January 8th. No social media, no international calls, even ATM machines stopped working. They wanted the world to look away, because what came next would be one of the deadliest massacres in modern Iranian history. And Khamenei himself gave the order. January 8th and 9th, 2026. Across all 31 provinces of Iran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Basij militia opened fire on unarmed protesters with live ammunition, not rubber bullets, not tear gas. Live fire from military-grade weapons aimed directly at crowds. According to leaked hospital data reported by Time magazine and investigated by Iran International, at least 30,000 people were killed in just those 2 days. The Iranian government claims 3,117 total deaths. Human rights organizations have verified at least 6,126 deaths. But doctors inside Iran, speaking anonymously, describe hospitals overwhelmed with bodies, makeshift morgues in warehouse facilities, and families searching through body bags to find their loved ones. Amnesty International verified video footage from a morgue in Karizak, near Tehran, showing at least 205 distinct body bags in a single overflow facility. One video shows families walking through rooms of bodies piled on top of each other. A BBC Persian report describes rooms so full of corpses the doors wouldn't open. A doctor quoted by the Sunday Times called it genocide under cover of digital darkness. This wasn't crowd control that got out of hand. According to reports citing sources in Iran's Supreme National Security Council, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself gave the order on January 9th. Crush the protests by any means necessary. The New York Times confirmed this directive. Security forces weren't defending the regime. They were massacring Iranian citizens on direct orders from the top. And that's when everything changed. Because the same man who ordered thousands of his own people killed suddenly went into hiding 3 days later, January 23, 2026. Intelligence reports from Iran International confirm that Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has been transferred to a secure underground complex in Tehran. The facility is described as a fortified shelter with interconnected tunnels, designed to withstand military strikes and equipped with systems to block electronic surveillance. But physical security came with a strategic cost. Cut off from normal communication channels to prevent signal intelligence interception, Khamenei's ability to govern effectively has been severely compromised. His connection to the outside world now flows through a single person, his 53-year-old third son, Masoud Khamenei. Masoud is not a military commander. He's not a political figure. He's a religious scholar who has spent his career teaching at seminaries in Qom. He holds no official government position. He has no experience managing a country in crisis, yet overnight he became the primary channel of communication between the supreme leader and Iran's executive branches, security forces, and military command. This arrangement creates what analysts describe as a dangerous bottleneck. Orders from the bunker must be delivered through Masoud via physical couriers or encrypted cables. Decision-making that used to take hours now takes days. In a crisis situation where Iran faces both internal uprising and external military threat, this delay could be fatal. The regime's response time has slowed to a crawl precisely when it needs to move fastest. While Khamenei hides underground, a massive American military force is moving into position. On January 23rd, President Trump announced that a U.S. naval armada was heading toward Iran. He wasn't exaggerating. The USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier strike group arrived in U.S. Central Command's area of responsibility in the Indian Ocean on January 26-27, 2026. The carrier commands dozens of F/A-18 Super Hornet fighter jets and approximately 5,000 crew members. Flanking it are 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, USS Frank E. Peterson Jr., USS Spruance, and USS Michael Murphy. These warships carry Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of striking targets deep inside Iran. Trump has been direct about his intentions. "We're watching Iran. We have a big force going toward Iran," he told reporters aboard Air Force One. "Maybe we won't have to use it. We have a lot of ships going that direction, just in case." On January 27th, he added, "There's another beautiful armada floating beautifully towards Iran right now." But the threat isn't just military posturing. Trump has also stated he knows where Khamenei is hiding. "I know where he is," Trump said, "but we're holding off for now." The implication is clear. The U.S. has the intelligence and the capability to strike Khamenei's location if Trump decides to give the order. The timing of this military buildup is not coincidental. It came immediately after the massacre of protesters. Trump warned Iran against executing detained demonstrators and positioned American forces to give weight to that warning. Iran's supreme leader now faces threats from every direction simultaneously. From below, millions of his own citizens want him gone. From above, American military assets are within striking range. From within, the economic system is collapsing. And from his position underground, he can barely communicate effectively with his own government. This is the definition of strategic paralysis. Every option available to Khamenei comes with catastrophic risks. Crack down harder on protesters? The death toll could trigger international military intervention. Negotiate with protesters? That shows weakness and could embolden the opposition movement. Launch preemptive military strikes? That invites the full force of American retaliation. Do nothing? The protests continue and the regime loses legitimacy daily. The appointment of Masoud Khamenei to manage daily operations creates additional problems within the regime itself. Many expected Khamenei's second son, Mojtaba, to be the natural successor and primary figure in any crisis. Mojtaba has spent decades building power networks within the IRGC and intelligence services. He's politically experienced and has military connections. Yet he's been sidelined while his younger brother Masoud, a seminary teacher with no political background, serves as the communication channel. This arrangement raises questions about internal regime dynamics. Is Masoud chosen because he's trustworthy or because he's controllable? Is this temporary crisis management or the beginning of a succession process that could split the regime's elite? The answers aren't clear, but the confusion itself is destabilizing. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has been Khamenei's primary instrument of power for decades. The IRGC crushed the 2009 Green Movement. It put down the 2019 protests. And in January 2026, IRGC forces carried out the massacre that killed thousands. By all accounts, the IRGC remains fundamentally loyal to Khamenei and the system. But loyalty under normal circumstances doesn't guarantee loyalty during a succession crisis or regime collapse. The IRGC is not a monolithic organization. It's a complex network of commanders, units, and factions with different interests and power bases. When Khamenei eventually dies or is removed from power, those factions will compete to shape Iran's future. Some analysts warn that Iran could drift from theocratic dictatorship to pure military dictatorship. Less calm, more Pyongyang. The clerical establishment that justified the IRGC's power would be sidelined, and uniformed officers would rule directly. This transition might not require a violent coup. It could happen gradually, as the IRGC fills the power vacuum left by an aging, isolated supreme leader who can no longer govern effectively. For now, IRGC commanders have placed their forces on highest alert and declared absolute loyalty to Khamenei. General Mohammad Pakpour stated Iranian forces are more ready than ever, finger on the trigger, to carry out Khamenei's orders. But these declarations of loyalty come at a moment when Khamenei's actual ability to lead is severely constrained by his physical isolation. Iran's economic crisis isn't a temporary downturn. It's a structural collapse that's been building for years and accelerated dramatically in 2025-2026. The rial's value has plummeted. Inflation exceeds 120%. Essential goods are scarce or unaffordable for ordinary Iranians. The government's response has been almost comically inadequate, offering families subsidies of $7 per person per month to buy from a limited list of 9 food items. The protests that began on December 28th started in Tehran's Grand Bazaar for a reason. These merchants have historically been the regime's economic backbone and political supporters. When they shut down their shops in protest, it signaled that even the regime's traditional base had lost faith in the system's economic management. Iran's isolation compounds the problem. International sanctions limit access to foreign currency and technology. The June 2025 Israeli strikes on nuclear facilities damaged Iran's strategic capabilities and further weakened the economy. Regional proxy forces like Hezbollah and the Houthis consume resources without generating economic returns. Iran is spending money it doesn't have to maintain regional influence while its own population suffers. The regime tried to buy time by increasing security spending by nearly 150% while offering wage increases that amount to only 40% of the inflation rate. This allocation of resources, more for repression, less for people's welfare, makes clear what the regime prioritizes. But you can't repress your way out of economic collapse indefinitely. Iran's crisis isn't happening in isolation. The international response has been swift and overwhelming. The UN Human Rights Council held an emergency session. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International documented the massacres. The International Criminal Court has been called upon to investigate. Countries worldwide condemned the killings. But the most significant international pressure comes from Washington and Tel Aviv. Trump's positioning of naval forces near Iran represents not just military threat, but diplomatic leverage. He's made clear that further executions of detained protesters would trigger very strong action. Israel, meanwhile, has increased its war readiness, viewing Iran's instability as both opportunity and potential threat. Reports indicate that Iranian officials have begun moving money out of the country. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated they've tracked officials abandoning ship, transferring millions and potentially billions of dollars to foreign accounts. One Israeli media report claims $1.5 billion in cryptocurrency was sent to Dubai, with Mojtaba Khamenei allegedly involved in transferring approximately $328 million. This capital flight indicates that even regime insiders are preparing for possible collapse. When the elite start protecting their personal assets instead of defending the system, it signals a loss of confidence in the regime's survival prospects. Iran's opposition leader Reza Pahlavi, son of the former Shah, has called for international support for protesters and directly addressed Khamenei, comparing him to Nazi criminals who face trial at Nuremberg. Behind the statistics and geopolitical analysis are human stories of unimaginable tragedy, families searching through makeshift morgues for their children, parents identifying teenagers from photographs because the bodies are too numerous to view directly, a 5-year-old shot while in their mother's arms, according to a doctor's testimony to CNN, medical workers treating wounded protesters in secret clinics because hospitals report patients to security forces. The government's internet blackout wasn't just about controlling information, it was about hiding crimes, with international journalists unable to report and Iranians unable to share videos or photos. Security forces operated with impunity. Witness testimony describes protesters raising their hands in surrender and being shot anyway. Reports detail wounded individuals being finished off in the streets and even in medical facilities. The psychological impact extends beyond the immediate violence. Amnesty International reports that detained protesters are being subjected to torture and sexual assault in custody. Iran International documented cases of detainees being injected with unknown chemical substances. These aren't isolated incidents of abuse. They're systematic tactics designed to break the opposition movement through terror. Yet despite this brutality, the protests continue in various forms. General strikes persist in some areas. Funerals for killed protesters become political demonstrations. Underground networks coordinate resistance activities. The regime may have temporarily suppressed visible mass protests, but it hasn't broken the population's will. What it has done is create a level of hatred and trauma that makes reconciliation impossible. Ali Khamenei is 86 years old, he's had prostate surgery, and is rumored to have cancer. Even without external threats, biological reality means Iran will face a succession question soon. The supreme leader's position in Iran's theocratic system is supposed to be filled by the assembly of experts through months-long deliberations. But Khamenei's sudden isolation in an underground bunker forces the question, what happens if he dies or becomes incapacitated while hiding? The New York Times reported in June 2025 that Khamenei had nominated 3 clerics as potential successors while hiding in a bunker during the 12-day war with Israel. But potential nominees and actual succession are very different things. The process is supposed to be orderly and deliberate. A sudden transition during a crisis would be chaotic and potentially violent. Multiple candidates have been mentioned: Ebrahim Raisi, Mojtaba Khamenei, and others. But none has the religious credentials, political base, and security apparatus loyalty necessary to guarantee a smooth transition. The clerical establishment questions the religious authority of potential successors. The IRGC has its own institutional interests. The government ministries are already weakened by economic crisis. A succession fight under these conditions could fracture the regime entirely. What makes this succession crisis unique is its timing. It's not just about who replaces Khamenei. It's about whether the Islamic Republic's governmental system survives at all. Popular legitimacy has collapsed. Economic management has failed. Regional influence is waning. The next supreme leader, if there is one, will inherit a system in far worse shape than Khamenei inherited in 1989. For 45 years, Iran's Islamic Republic projected an image of strength and permanence. The regime survived war with Iraq, it weathered international sanctions, it built a network of regional proxies, it developed nuclear capabilities despite international opposition, it crushed multiple protest movements. The message was clear: this regime cannot be defeated. January 2026 shattered that illusion. The supreme leader hiding in a bunker is not an image of strength. Thousands of civilians massacred in the streets is not a sign of popularity. Economic collapse requiring $7 monthly subsidies per person is not successful governance. Capital flight by regime insiders is not confidence in the system. What Iran's crisis reveals is the fundamental brittleness of authoritarian systems that rely on fear rather than legitimacy. They appear strong until the moment they don't. The wall of fear can hold for decades, but once it cracks, it can crumble quickly. We've seen this pattern in the Soviet Union's collapse, in the Arab Spring uprisings, and countless other examples throughout history. The Islamic Republic's claim to religious legitimacy has been particularly damaged. When protesters in Qom, the center of Shia religious education, chant against the supreme leader, it signals that even in the regime's religious heartland, many have lost faith. When merchants in the Grand Bazaar, the regime's traditional economic supporters, lead protests, the social contract has broken. When clerics reportedly wear civilian clothes to avoid being targeted by angry citizens, religious authority has evaporated. Iran's internal crisis has immediate implications for the entire Middle East. For over 2 decades, Iran has built influence through proxy forces, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, various militias in Iraq and Syria. This network, often called the Axis of Resistance, has been Iran's primary tool for projecting power beyond its borders. But proxy relationships require 2 things: money and credibility. Iran's economic collapse limits the money available, and a supreme leader hiding in a bunker while his own people rebel severely damages credibility. Why would regional proxy forces remain loyal to a patron that may be in its final days? There are already signs of concern among Iran's allies. Hezbollah's leadership has been carefully worded in its statements about potential support for Iran. Reports suggest that communication channels between Tehran and proxy forces have become less reliable. The chaos of succession planning and internal crisis management means less attention to regional coordination. For Israel and Gulf Arab states, Iran's weakness presents both opportunity and danger. Opportunity to reduce Iran's regional influence, while it's distracted by internal problems. Danger that Iran might launch external military operations to rally domestic support or distract from internal failures. Danger also that Iran's collapse could create power vacuums across the region. The United States faces similar calculations. How much to pressure Iran versus how much to prepare for potential regime collapse and its aftermath. Military positioning sends a message, but what comes after potential military action or regime change? As of late January 2026, Iran's situation remains fundamentally unresolved and deeply unstable. Multiple critical questions have no clear answers yet. First, will the Islamic Republic survive? The regime has temporarily suppressed visible mass protests through extreme violence, but that doesn't mean stability. Underground resistance continues. Economic conditions haven't improved, international pressure persists, and Khamenei's physical isolation means the regime is operating with degraded leadership capacity. Second, what will trigger the next phase? Will it be Khamenei's death or further incapacitation? Another round of mass protests? U.S. military action? Israeli strikes? An IRGC internal power struggle? Economic total collapse? All of these remain possible. Third, if regime change occurs, what replaces the Islamic Republic? The protest movement includes monarchists wanting to restore the Pahlavi dynasty, secular Democrats, ethnic minorities seeking autonomy, and various other factions. Unity against the regime doesn't guarantee unity about what comes next. Syria's civil war showed how opposition movements can fracture violently after toppling a dictator. Fourth, how will regional powers respond? Will Saudi Arabia and UAE try to shape Iran's future? Will Turkey intervene? Will Russia or China try to prevent complete Iranian collapse? Will Israel see opportunity for permanent security improvements or new threats from chaos? Fifth, what is the U.S. strategy? Trump has positioned military forces and issued warnings, but actual policy remains unclear. Is the goal regime change or behavior change? If regime change, who does Washington support afterward? What's the plan for Iran's nuclear program during a transition? These questions don't have answers yet because the situation is still unfolding. January 2026 may be remembered as the beginning of the Islamic Republic's end. Or it may be another crisis that the regime survives damaged but intact. History will determine which. So what does all of this mean? The streets of Tehran are quieter now than they were in early January. Security forces have temporarily reasserted control through overwhelming violence. The internet blackout continues. From a superficial glance, it might appear that the regime has weathered the storm and survived once again. But survival and stability are not the same thing. Ali Khamenei remains underground in a bunker, isolated from normal communication, dependent on his third son to relay information and orders. That's not a sign of strength. That's a sign of a leader who fears for his life from external military threat and potentially from his own population. The death toll from the January massacres, whether it's the government's figure of 3,117, human rights organizations confirmed 6,126, or the reported 30,000 from leaked hospital data, represents a level of violence that creates generational trauma and permanent opposition. You cannot kill thousands of civilians in their own cities and expect their families to forget or forgive. The Islamic Republic has created an entire population of people who will never accept its legitimacy. Meanwhile, the USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group sits in waters within range of Iran. President Trump continues to state he knows where Khamenei is hiding. The economic crisis that triggered this uprising hasn't been resolved. Iran's currency remains devalued. Inflation remains over 120%. The structural problems haven't changed. What happens next could reshape not just Iran, but the entire Middle East. The Islamic Republic has survived 45 years through a combination of ideological commitment, security force loyalty, and strategic flexibility. But all three of those pillars have weakened significantly. The ideology no longer commands broad support. Security forces are stretched and exhausted, and strategic flexibility is limited when your supreme leader is underground and can barely communicate. The question isn't whether Iran is facing a crisis. That's obvious. The question is whether this crisis is manageable or terminal, whether the regime adapts and survives, or whether these are the final days of the Islamic Republic. No one can answer that question with certainty yet. But the fact that Iran's absolute ruler is hiding in a bunker while American warships sail toward his country and his own citizens demand his overthrow suggests the answer might be becoming clear. This story is far from over. Every day brings new developments in this rapidly evolving situation. If you want to understand where this is really heading, subscribe to Nora Blake and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next analysis. And let me know in the comments. Do you think the Islamic Republic will survive this crisis? Or are we watching the beginning of the end of Iran's theocratic system? Your perspective matters. Share this analysis with anyone who needs to understand what's really happening in Iran. The mainstream media often misses the deeper strategic picture. This is what they're not telling you. The supreme leader is underground. His people are dead in the streets. American warships are closing in, and no one knows how this ends.